pleasure to introduce the first speaker in this series. Reflecting or thinking about architecture from another perspective, the perspective of the philosopher. But all the people that you have been introduced to, one is an architect, one has a brother as an architect and is associated with the University of Pretoria, and Professor Goosen has taught architects over a good number of years, I suppose, if not through any other means, only by osmosis, has a pretty shrewd idea of what architects might be about. He has studied economics, classical languages, philosophy and theology. He's professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of South Africa. He's a member of various academic associations, amongst others, Suid-Afrikaanse Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kuns. He also serves on the editorial board of various academic journals, amongst others, Tydskrif vir Geesteswetenskappe. His research focuses on the interface between philosophy, religion, and politics, with a special emphasis on contemporary society. He has presented various papers on related questions, both locally and internationally, and published widely in academic journals and in the popular media. You've probably come across him in the popular media. He has also published a comprehensive study on postmodern society, Die Nihilism, Notice oor ons tyd in 2007, I suppose I should say in 2007. As chairperson of the Federasie van Afrikaanse Kultuurverenigingen, FAK, he strives for full recognition of the multiplicity of languages and cultural communities in South Africa. He serves as director on the board of AfriForum and Civil Rights Initiatives of Solidarity. He's married to Professor Amanda Dupré from the Department of Visual Arts here at the University of Pretoria, and we are happy to let him then introduce his lecture. Thank you. Thank you.
Baie dankie, vriende, vir die verskriklike groot uitnodiging. Dis heerlik om na enkele jare weer hier betrokke te wees in hierdie hoedanigheid. I find myself rather in an awkward position because, as Roger said, I'm not a trained architect, not at all. Therefore, please understand the following remarks as those of a layman. Although I have an interest in architecture, it is nevertheless a deeply amateurish interest. Friends, the following remarks is to address an issue that is often not directly visible in architecture, but nevertheless presupposed by all architectural practices. I am referring to the fact that architecture, like any other discipline, rests on philosophical presuppositions. And the latter is, of course, very much in the focus of my discussion tonight. However, instead of discussing the role of philosophical presuppositions in general, I will rather focus on two specific but widely different schools in contemporary philosophy. My hope is that a focus on these two different schools of philosophical thought may help us to think about architectural space in, let's say, fundamental ways. For our purposes, we will refer in broad terms, and please remember this is only a lecture based on broad references to these two different schools. We will refer to deconstruction on the one hand, and the so-called radical orthodoxy movement on the other hand. So I'll refer to these two different schools. In the first part, we will make some introductory remarks, while the second and more substantial part will address in more detail their widely different interpretations of traditional Western philosophy. In the background of this discussion, and this is a theme running through the whole lecture, will be, you will recognize a certain concern about the cultural condition of contemporary human beings. A certain deep concern. In fact, the basic assumption behind these reflections is that architecture, but also the economy, social reality, political life, etc., are confronted by the phenomena of nihilism. And of course, as you know, the word nihilism can be referred back to the word nihil, meaning nothing, or nihilism, the idea that being or reality is in itself meaningless. The very idea behind this assessment of our cultural condition, namely that it is to be described as nihilistic. Nihilism casts its dark shadow on each and every page of this presentation. So let's start with the introduction. And this is merely some remarks that I'm sure that you are familiar with. The founder of deconstruction was the Algerian-born Frenchman Jacques Derrida. And although Derrida died in 2004, deconstruction still plays a role not only in formal philosophy, but even in popular culture. In fact, deconstruction has become something of a popular catchphrase, the word in itself, with the likes of Woody Allen and Hollywood using the concept deconstruction without the slightest indication that it, for example, that is, deconstruction, represents a radical step away from traditional philosophy. However, when I refer to deconstruction, I will use the concept in a rather wide sense of the word and will therefore include philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, that already died in 1900, and Martin Heidegger died in 1976, who certainly played an important formative role in the creation of contemporary deconstruction. As far as the radical orthodoxy group is concerned, I will refer to its most important representative, namely John Milbank. Now, Milbank is very much alive and at the forefront of quite exciting theological and philosophical research done at the University of Nottingham. Its creative impulses, and this is very much at the background of radical orthodoxy, its creative impulses are provided by a renewed interest in and rereading, a radical postmodern rereading of classical and medieval philosophy. So although deconstruction and radical orthodoxy differ in terms of their understanding of traditional Western philosophy, they have a certain, let's say, a certain postmodern flavor in common. Both are deeply influenced by the so-called language turn in 20th century philosophy, perhaps the founding moment of postmodernism. And of course, the language turn says that we don't have direct access to being or to reality. On the contrary, we only know being in a mediate way, that is, through the medium of language, narratives, stories, symbols, signs, signifiers, etc., etc. In short, both these two movements accept that we are storytelling beings. Without language, being is silent. It's a common denominator between these two movements. But even more, deconstruction and radical orthodoxy also have in common a similar assessment of modern philosophy. Of course, modern philosophy started way back. Some people argue that it even started in the 13th century, but for common purposes, we refer to modern philosophy as that movement within philosophy that started, let's say, in the 17th century. They have a common assessment of modern philosophy, these two movements. Although for almost opposite reasons, and we'll refer to that, both these movements tend to view modernism and modern philosophy as deeply inscribed within the logic of nihilism that I referred to in the beginning. According to deconstruction, and especially the Nietzschean version of deconstruction, modern philosophy is marked by the tendency to build a new world on the basis of an appeal to abstract reason, a very common interpretation of modern philosophy. But this is why modernism can be described as nihilistic, at least according to Nietzsche. In his attempt, that is, in modernist attempt to view everything through the lens of abstract reason, so much part of the modern mindset, modernism tried to escape from what Nietzsche perceived to be the true nature of reality or being. According to Nietzsche, being is in essence without purpose, without design or reason. In short, according to Nietzsche, reality is without foundations, meaning, or final points of reference. Modernism is nothing but an attempt to escape reality understood in these radical terms. And by attempting to escape being thus understood, modernism, according to Nietzsche, proves itself to be nihilistic. So a specific understanding of what nihilism is, the Nietzschean one. Underlying this view is the assumption that we can transcend nihilism if we are willing to embrace this radical understanding of reality. As followers of Nietzsche puts it, we should answer nihilism by saying yes to being understood as a dark abyss. That is more or less the understanding. If we escape from the abyss, then we are falling into the trap of nihilism. But if we do embrace it, we transcend nihilism, according to the Nietzschean argument. Radical orthodoxy, on the other hand, argues that modernism is not so much nihilistic because it tries to escape from being understood as a dark abyss, but rather because modernism paved the way for this dark understanding of being. In other words, modernism is nihilistic not because it attempts to escape the abyss, but precisely because it's leaving us adrift on a sea of meaninglessness. Underlying this is an even more important difference between the two schools that I'm referring to. It has to do with the fact that they view traditional Western philosophy in radically different terms. While deconstruction generally tends to view traditional philosophy in negative terms, and of course, therefore, the attempt to disrupt or deconstruct Western philosophy internally. This is exactly what is deconstruction, is an attempt to disrupt Western philosophy from within. Radical orthodoxy pleads for a postmodern rediscovery of the basic truths at the basis of Western philosophy. So totally different perceptions of Western philosophy. According to deconstruction, the historical antecedents of modern nihilism can be traced back to traditional Western philosophy. In other words, according to deconstruction, Western philosophy is already, that is, even before nihilism came to the fore in modernism, a manifestation of nihilism. Why? Because Western philosophy is in essence an attempt to escape, according to deconstruction, from the meaningless nature of being. In short, if modernism attempted to escape nothingness, Western philosophy did exactly the same, even centuries before modernism set out on its own journey. Radical orthodoxy gives an answer completely opposed to this. The reason why radical orthodoxy pleads the case of traditional Western philosophy is not because the latter is a manifestation of nihilism, but precisely because it is our answer to nihilism. In fact, says radical orthodoxy, nihilism reigns because we have forgotten the truths at the basis of Western philosophy. Friends, this brings me to the main part of this lecture after these few introductory remarks. In the second part, I would like to pay attention to the different interpretations of Western philosophy by deconstruction and radical orthodoxy, and hopefully some of the implications for architecture will be clear after this. Let's first refer to deconstruction and traditional Western philosophy. During classical times, and I start way back almost at the beginning of the history of philosophy, during classical times, Plato, remember, he died in 347 before Christ. During classical times, Plato and Aristotle, his pupil, and that also died, well, he died in 322 before Christ. During classical times, Plato and Aristotle laid the foundations of Western philosophy, well-known statement. And during the high medieval ages, one can roughly refer to the high Middle Ages as between 1050 and 1300, Western thought was brought to a concluding high point in the theology and philosophy of Thomas Aquinas that died in 1274. So this is, when I'm referring to Western philosophy, traditional Western philosophy, of course, one can include many more names in this, but just for the sake of the argument, I'm referring to Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas, the whole tradition captured by these people. How does deconstruction read and deconstruct Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas? This is an important question. According to deconstruction, the essence of Western philosophy can be captured by the following. In the first place, traditional Western philosophy is by nature dualistic. So this is an important point I would like to raise, and I'll return to this during the lecture. According to deconstruction, we are left with Western dualism. Whenever Western philosophy thought about reality, it used dualist pairs in terms of which it structured reality. Traditional Western philosophy is based on oppositions that exclude each other, according to the deconstructive reading. Like the opposition between God and human beings. So one can use many, many examples, but let's mention a few. God and human beings. Or the transcendent and the immanent. Or the spiritual, or the spirit and the body, rather. Etc., etc. One can continue with this list. And to use perhaps a better example, the opposition between the living voice, because this has become quite important within the deconstruction, the voice over against writing, etc., etc., or the inside versus the outside. The rational versus the irrational, the male versus the female, to use the simple oppositions used by Plato. So this is the first point. It is dualistic. The second point is that